It's very interesting and a great deal of fun. As a matter of fact, working in pictures has taught me so much about other industries.
For nearly 5 decades, she was the definition of a movie star. She clawed her way out of poverty, reinvented herself more times than any studio publicist could count, and turned raw ambition into an Academy Award. Audiences adored her. Magazines couldn't get enough of her. And yet, when Joan Crawford died in May of 1977, the woman who had spent her entire life chasing attention was buried in front of a room that was, by Hollywood standards, almost embarrassingly empty. No sweeping tribute. No parade of A-list mourners. Just a small, hushed gathering that left people asking the same question for years afterward. How does someone that famous end up at a funeral that quiet? To understand the answer, you have to go back to the very beginning, because the seeds of that lonely goodbye were planted decades before anyone thought to ask the question. Long before she was Joan Crawford, she was Lucille LeSueur, born in San Antonio, Texas, to a family that was already coming apart before she could walk. Her father left when she was still an infant, and her mother was left to raise the children largely on her own before remarrying a man who ran a small theater in Oklahoma. It was in that theater, watching performers move across a lit stage night after night, that young Lucille first fell in love with the idea of being watched. She wanted the applause. She wanted the spotlight. What she didn't yet know was that the man she believed to be her father wasn't her biological one at all, a secret that would eventually come out and add one more crack to an already fractured sense of family. Her childhood was defined by hardship rather than comfort. An accident left her with a badly injured foot that required multiple surgeries and kept her out of school and away from the dance lessons she loved for a long stretch of her early years. Financial trouble followed her stepfather, and the family was forced to relocate more than once, eventually settling in Missouri. There, young Lucille was enrolled in a strict Catholic school, but when her mother and stepfather split for good, she was left to work offered tuition through hours of scrubbing floors and washing dishes rather than sitting in a classroom. She would repeat that same arrangement at another school shortly after, trading labor for a place to sleep and a chance at an education that never fully materialized. By her teenage years, she had briefly attempted college, inflating her age on the application and abandoning the effort within a matter of months. Formal education was never going to be her path. What she had instead was raw determination, a body built for dancing, and an instinct for self-promotion that would define the rest of her life. She started entering talent contests and dancing in traveling stage shows, refusing to let her lack of money or family stability stop her from chasing the one thing she had wanted since childhood: to be seen. Her break came not through connections or privilege, but through sheer visibility. While performing on the road, she caught the eye of a producer who brought her into a Broadway production. It wasn't stardom, but it was a foothold, and she used it to push further. She sought out a publicist who could get her in front of the right people, and eventually that networking paid off in the form of a screen test that made its way to a Hollywood studio executive. By the end of 1924, she had a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and a train ticket to California. Her earliest film work was Unglamorous. Her first appearance on screen didn't even show her face. She was a stand-in body double for another actress in a silent picture. She picked up small, forgettable parts throughout 1925, and even her own name became a problem. Studio publicists worried that her birth name sounded unappealing when spoken aloud, so they ran a magazine contest inviting the public to rename her. The name that won, Joan Crawford, wasn't one she particularly liked at first. She thought it sounded like a type of shellfish. But she understood the value of the platform that came with it, and she adopted it fully. What separated her from the dozens of other hopeful young actresses under contract at MGM was her refusal to sit back and wait to be discovered twice. She went to every dance hall in Los Angeles where a casting director might be watching. She entered public dance competitions and won them. She built her own buzz through pure hustle, and it worked. Small parts turned into noticeable ones, and by the mid-1920s, she had become one of the young actresses the industry expected big things from. She wasn't naive about the politics of the studio system either. She once remarked, with typical bluntness, that competing with MGM's reigning leading lady was nearly impossible given that the woman was married to the studio's head of production. Crawford understood early on that talent alone wouldn't be enough. She would have to outwork everyone around her, and she did. Her true breakthrough came in 1928, when she was cast as a spirited, modern young woman in a film that captured the restless energy of the jazz age. The role made her the on-screen embodiment of the flapper generation, bold, glamorous, a little reckless, but with an undercurrent of sadness that other performers playing similar characters simply didn't have. It was that emotional complexity that set her apart, and it caught the attention of serious literary figures of the era, who saw in her a symbol of the modern woman navigating a changing world. She leaned into that image rather than running from it, famously suggesting that anyone looking for a wholesome girl-next-door type should look somewhere other than the movie theater. As the decade turned, the film industry itself was thrown into chaos by the arrival of synchronized sound. Careers that had been built entirely on silent-era charisma collapsed overnight because voices didn't match faces or performances didn't translate to dialogue. Crawford refused to be one of the casualties. She drilled herself relentlessly, reading aloud, training her voice, determined not to let the transition end her career before it had really begun. It worked. She moved into talking pictures and kept working steadily throughout the early 1930s, appearing alongside some of the biggest leading men of the era and gradually shedding the flapper persona for more dramatic, complicated roles. By the early part of the decade, she had cemented herself as one of the most bankable stars in the country, appearing in a Best Picture winner and headlining films that defined the fashion and mood of the era. Stardom in Hollywood has never been permanent, and Crawford's first real taste of that truth came in the late 1930s. After a decade near the top of the industry, her box office numbers started slipping. A group of theater owners went so far as to publicly brand her, along with several other major actresses, as a liability rather than an asset, claiming their films no longer justified the salaries being paid. It was a humiliating label for someone who had clawed her way up from nothing. But it wasn't the end of her. She fought back the only way she knew how, by taking on riskier roles that showed audiences a different side of her range, including villainous and morally complicated characters that let her prove she was more than her earlier glamorous image. It bought her time, but she could feel the ground shifting underneath a position at the studio that had built her into a star. After nearly 2 decades there, she made a decision to walk away entirely, ending one of the longest actor-studio relationships in the industry at the time. Leaving MGM could have ended her career. Instead, it launched one of the most celebrated comebacks in Hollywood history. She signed with a rival studio and, after some uneven early efforts, fought hard for a leading role that the director initially wanted to give to someone else entirely. She won the part, and the film became not just a commercial hit, but the vehicle for an Academy Award win, cementing her as one of few stars of her generation to prove that a career could survive, even thrive, after being written off. The years that followed brought more acclaim, more nominations, and more leading roles built around tough, resilient women navigating difficult circumstances, characters that in many ways mirrored her own real-life reputation for toughness. But as the 1950s progressed, the volume of work slowed. Her personal life increasingly took center stage, particularly after she married the president of a major beverage corporation and became involved in its corporate board once he passed away. She kept accepting film and television roles into the 1960s, but the parts were smaller, further apart, and eventually she stepped away from acting entirely after one final horror picture at the start of the 1970s. What almost nobody outside her inner circle understood at the time was how dramatically her private world differed from her public image. She married 4 times, and each of those marriages carried its own complicated story. A secret wedding to a Hollywood royal family son that never fully won the approval of his famous parents, a marriage to an actor more devoted to stage work than film stardom, which ended after heartbreaking miscarriages and escalating conflict, a brief union that lasted barely a few years, and finally, a 4th marriage to a corporate executive that seemed to bring her the closest thing to lasting peace. She'd experienced in adulthood. Her relationships with her children were, by most accounts, even more complicated. She adopted several children over the years, and their recollections of her as a mother diverged sharply. Some describe a devoted, if demanding, parent. Others describe a woman who kept them at an emotional distance, more concerned with image and control than connection. One of her children would eventually write a deeply critical memoir after Crawford's death, exposing a side of her private life that shocked fans who only knew the glamorous public persona. It was a rupture that never healed, and it would echo loudly in the final chapter of her story. Add to that a decades-long, very public rivalry with another leading actress of the era, a feud fueled by competition over roles, awards, and the limited amount of space Hollywood was willing to give powerful, outspoken women at the time. Their mutual dislike became almost as famous as either their filmographies. Spilling out to interviews, award season maneuvering in a famously tense on-set collaboration on a horror film late in both of their careers. It was a rivalry neither woman ever fully let go of, right up until Crawford's death. By the early 1970s, Crawford's public appearances had become rare enough that each one felt like an event. She accepted a Lifetime Achievement-style honor at an award ceremony, revisited the college she had briefly attended decades earlier to share stories from her life, and published a pair of memoirs offering her own account of survival and success in an unforgiving industry. Her last truly triumphant public moment came in the spring of 1973, when she was celebrated as a guest of honor at a large tribute event in New York, an evening where the crowd's enthusiasm made it clear that, whatever her box office standing, she was still adored. After that night, she withdrew. She downsized to a smaller apartment in the same New York building, and her public sightings dwindled to almost nothing. Her final appearance in front of cameras came at a book event in 1974, and unflattering photographs from that night, capturing a woman who no longer resembled the polished star audiences remembered, were widely circulated. It was, by most accounts, the last time the public saw her at all. For nearly 3 years, she essentially disappeared from view entirely, staying inside her apartment, avoiding the cameras that had once been her lifeblood. Joan Crawford died of a heart attack in her New York apartment in May of 1977, at 69 years old. In the days leading up to her death, in a small, almost heartbreaking detail, she gave away her beloved pet, reportedly because she no longer felt strong enough to care for the animal. It was a quiet admission that the woman who had spent a lifetime projecting strength and control knew her body was failing her. Her funeral, held just days later at a well-known Manhattan funeral home, was startlingly small for someone of her stature. Roughly 75 people attended, a number that shocked outside observers, expecting a send-off befitting one of the biggest names in film history. But the smallness wasn't an accident, nor was it a sign that the world had forgotten her. It was, according to those close to the family, exactly what her children and closest friends wanted. Something private, something quiet, away from a media circus that had surrounded so much of her public life. Her surviving children, who remained close to her, were present, along with friends from both the entertainment industry and the corporate world. She'd become part of through her final marriage. Notably absent was a daughter who would go on to publish that scathing memoir about her upbringing, a daughter whose estrangement from her mother had clearly not healed by the time Crawford passed away. One niece did make an appearance, representing what remained of Crawford's birth family, a small but meaningful gesture given how few blood relatives she had left. In keeping with her personal faith, the service followed the tenets of Christian Science, with none of the theatrical trappings one might expect for a star of her caliber, no lavish floor arrangements, no dramatic eulogies performed for cameras, just a modest, dignified goodbye. It wasn't the only farewell, however. A larger memorial service followed several days later at a church in New York, organized in part by the beverage company her late husband had led. That event drew a far bigger crowd, several hundred people, including actors and entertainers who spoke fondly of her, and a musical tribute performed by a well-known singer of the era. It was a kind of grand send-off many had expected from the start, just delayed and separated from a more intimate service her family had originally held. If the small funeral raised eyebrows, what followed raised even more. When Crawford was formally read, the scope of the shock became clear. She had left the bulk of her estate, valued at roughly $2 million, to a handful of charitable causes, and to the 2 youngest of her adopted daughters, each receiving a modest inheritance along with smaller gifts to her longtime secretary and a few others close to her. But 2 of her children, the same daughter who would author the tell-all memoir in one of her sons, were explicitly cut out entirely. The language in the will left no room for ambiguity or misinterpretation. She stated plainly that she intended to leave nothing to either of them, for reasons she said were already well understood between them. The 2 excluded children eventually challenged the will in court, and years later reached a settlement that gave each of them a modest sum, a fraction of what they might have expected from a mother whose estate have been worth so much more. The public fallout from that decision, combined with the unflattering memoir published not long after, permanently reshaped how many people remember Joan Crawford. The glamorous, hard-working survivor of Hollywood's studio system was suddenly recast, in the popular imagination, as a far colder and more troubled figure behind closed doors. In the end, the sparse turnout at her initial funeral wasn't really a mystery once you looked past the surface. It wasn't indifference from Hollywood, and it certainly wasn't a lack of fame or accomplishment. It was a deliberate choice made by a small circle of people who knew her most intimately, people who understood that Joan Crawford's public image and her private reality had rarely aligned, and who wanted her final moment to belong to the people who actually knew her, rather than to the cameras and columnists who had shaped so much of her legend. The larger memorial that came days later gave the wider industry its chance to say goodbye properly, but that quiet, private first service remains the more telling of the two. It reflected a woman whose relationships, with her children, with her rivals, with the public that had once adored her, were far more fractured and complicated than the glossy magazine covers ever let on. Joan Crawford spent her entire life fighting to be seen, clawing her way from a broken childhood in Texas to the very top of the film industry, reinventing herself again and again whenever the industry tried to count her out. But when it finally came time to say goodbye, the woman who had built an empire on being watched chose, in her family's hands at least, to leave quietly, on her own terms, away from the spotlight that had defined